Okay, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are. I hope you're doing well, and I hope that you had a nice weekend. We are studying Moreh Nevukhim, and we are doing so from the webyeshiva.org Facebook Live page. I am broadcasting to you from Thornhill, Ontario, in Canada. This is Daniel Karapkin, and we've been studying this for several weeks now. We are up to Moreh Nevukhim, Section 1, Chapter 34. We are in the middle of the chapter. Today's topic is, once again, the purpose of this chapter are the 5 causes that prevent the acquisition of esoteric knowledge, or a knowledge of what is what we could also call divine science, trying to understand God in as truest a way as a human being is capable of understanding the Almighty and the divine. This is our 3rd week that we are focusing on this chapter because it is a more lengthy chapter, a lot more text, and we are in the Pines edition, the Shlomo Pines edition of the translation of Moreh Nevukhim into English. We are on page 74. We have a handout for you today. If you'd like to get the handout, just open up a new tab in your browser and go to the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, and there is a JPEG version of the handout which might be of relevance to you today. Today we are focusing on the 3rd cause of the Rambam's 5 causes of things that prevent people from acquiring a true knowledge of Hashem. We had started this 3rd cause last week, and the cause essentially can be boiled down to the immensity of the prerequisite knowledge. There is a huge amount of knowledge that a person must first acquire before being able to go to a more advanced topic of trying to understand God. And people are reluctant to invest that kind of effort, which is extremely time-consuming and also a very big drain on one's mental resources, one's mental faculties. And because people are by nature tend to be lazy, let's face it, we're all a bit lazy to one degree or another, people are reluctant to get started because it's a huge task. It's a very, very daunting task. Now, that's really what the Rambam had set up until now. He had basically told us that, even the dullest of people, the people with the dullest of faculties, if you were to tell them, I can snap my finger, and in an instant you'll know everything that you need to know about X, about any particular subject. You want to know how to be a Kung Fu master? I'll just snap my fingers and you'll know Kung Fu. Or you want to be able to learn a new language? I'll snap my finger, you'll know how to do it. And obviously a person would jump at that opportunity. However, tell a person that they need to invest a week or a month of time taken off from work in order to be able to invest in a certain new area of knowledge or expertise, and people are going to say, you know what, I'll pass, it's not worth it. And that's generally the attitude of most people, is that most people are not prepared to put in the time that it takes and the effort to gain the prerequisite knowledge to be able to understand Hashem. Now, what is the prerequisite knowledge that is needed? This is what we're going to be seeing today. What is it that I would need to start off on if I was taking a university course in divine science and understanding God? What would be the prereqs, what they're called the prerequisites, in this educational regimen? So that's where we're up to. You know that these matters are mutually connected. What matters he's referring to are the study of the entire world that is around us. Everything that is around us that Hashem created, the heavens and the earth and all of its contents, are the prerequisite knowledge that we need to understand our surroundings. We need to study the world around us, both science, biology, mathematics, physics, chemistry, anatomy, zoology, botany. If we study all of these subjects, then we will have an entree into being able to understand God. Now, you may ask yourself the question, what do these things have to do with understanding God? So he says, they're all mutually connected. There being nothing in what exists besides God, may he be exalted, and the totality of the things he has made. So if you want to be able to get an entree to God, you have to study all those things outside of God that he made in order to leave a trail to his door. Because that's the function for the Rambam, the reason why God created this world, and the reason why he gave us the faculties to perceive this world, is as an entree to God himself. Now we know this not just from the Rambam, we know this from the Tanakh itself. It says in the Psalms, and we say this in our weekly prayers on Shabbat in the Psuke de Zimra, Hashamayim misaprim kavod kel, u'ma'aseh yadav magid harakia. The heavens are instructive, or they relate the glory of God, and his handiwork is instructive from the heavens. In other words, we just have to look up in the sky and learn about God. Yom liyom yabia omer v'layla l'layla yechaveh do'as, that every single day the heavens are an expression of the Almighty, and they instruct us. And the same thing is true with the earth. And that's why King David spends so much time in the Psalms, like in the Borchi Nafshi Psalm, talking about all of the things that God has created. And through those things, he is able to appreciate the Almighty. For this totality includes everything comprised in what exists, except only him. We have access to study everything in this world outside of God. And that in that way, God leads us to him. There is, moreover, no way to apprehend him except it be through the things he has made, for they are indicative of his existence and of what ought to be believed about him. I mean to say, of what should be affirmed and denied with regard to him. That once a person studies God, he's able to studies the world, he's able to understand God. Now, I should point out that even the Rambam will concede that a human being is limited in his ability to understand Hashem. But why did Hashem create the world in the way he did? He said, because there's a certain way that I wish for human beings to perceive me. And the way that I wish human beings to perceive me is through looking at my creation, and through that lens you will be able to perceive me in the way that I wish to be perceived. The Rambam is really, in Moreh Nevukhim over here, really saying something very similar to what he says in the Mishneh Torah. And that's source number 1 that you have in your handout, where the Rambam, at the very beginning of Mishneh Torah, in Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, at the end of chapter 4, Halacha Yud Bet, after he's described the metaphysics and the physics of this world, he then explains that's really what the first 4 chapters of Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah are all about. The first 2 chapters deal with, as we've discussed this before, the first 2 chapters deal with the metaphysics, explaining God and his holy entourage. And then the chapters 3 and 4 describe the world around us and the celestial bodies and everything that God has created in this world. What is the reason why it's important to know these things, especially why do they need to be codified in a book of Jewish law? So the Rambam writes as follows, Bizman sha'adam mitbonein badivarim ha'elu. When a person contemplates what I have just written about these things about the world around him, umakir kol haberuim mimalach vegalgal ve'adam kayotsebo, and a person is able to recognize everything that is existent in the world, from the highest celestial being, the angels, to the celestial spheres, down to the human being, and all other things that are like this. V'yireh chochmato shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chol ha'yitzurim v'chol habiruim, and he is able to sort of see the great wisdom of God in the way that he has created a hierarchy of creation. Mosif ahava lamakom, he only is now inspired with added love for his creator, for the omnipresent. V'titzma nafsho v'yichma b'saro le'ehov hamakom baruch hu, and he will pine even further to add to his love of the creator. V'yira v'yivchad mishifluto v'daluto v'kaluto Kishiyarich atzmo le'echad mehagufot hagidoshim hagidolim. And not only will he be filled with love, but he'll also be filled with a great sense of awe and fear and humility when he considers how insignificant and tiny he is and puny he is by comparison to the lofty creations that exist all around him. He looks out into space, and he sees all of the celestial bodies. He sees the vastness of the universe. He sees the majesty of the oceans and the mountains that God has created and has an appreciation for them. Then he will be filled with a great sense of humility to see how small he is in relation to all of those other things. V'kol shekain le'echat mehatzurot ha'teharot hanifradot min hagolmim shelo nitchabru bagolem klal. And he'll certainly be filled with that great sense of awe and humility when he contemplates the non-corporeal beings, the celestial beings, the angels, and realizes how insignificant he is by comparison to them. V'imtza atzmo shehu kichli malei v'usha'u chlima reik v'chaser. And he will discover that he will find in himself that he is like an empty vessel, only filled with embarrassment or a sense of abject shame of being so insignificant and flawed and imperfect. All right, now the Rambam in Hilchot Yisodei HaTorah is telling us the practical benefit that one gains on his emotional and mental state. But the Rambam over here is using that same kind of investigation to say that it's necessary to lead a person to lead him to God's doorstep and to be able to have access to divine science. So perhaps if we were to categorize it, what the Mishnah Torah is talking about is what the tachlis is when you investigate the world as far as how it affects your character and affects your day-to-day relationship with God. When you study the Moreh Nevukhim, you see that this kind of introspection and examination of the world around oneself leads one as the prerequisite knowledge to lead to a knowledge of God. But it's the same idea. And we continue. It is therefore indispensable to consider all beings as they really are, so that we may obtain for all the kinds of beings true and certain premises that would be useful to us in our researches pertaining to the divine science. This is how we understand God. We continue. How very many are the premises thus taken from the nature of numbers and the properties of geometrical figures, from which we draw inferences concerning things that we should deny with respect to God, may he be exalted. And here the Rambam's pointing out is that not only a study of the natural science is important, but if you study mathematics and geometry, then you learn about abstract concepts of numbers, but this also helps you understand what is not ascribable to God. And the way that the Rav Kreskas understands it is that God is the ultimate unity. And when you study math and you understand the uniqueness of the number one, they say one is the loneliest number, right? When you understand the uniqueness of the number one by comparison to all other things that are greater than one, then you understand that unitariness, if that's a word, is something that is different from any other idea of multiplicity that is part of the world that we experience. And this helps you better appreciate, when you study math and geometry, geometric configurations that exist in the world around us, you have a better appreciation for God's unitary essence, and therefore know how not to ascribe certain characteristics and features to God, because God is different from every other component of existence, which can be broken down mathematically or geometrically. Okay, and then we go on. And this denial is indicative to us of many notions. And we can, in other words, infer many things about God through a study of math and geometry. As for the matters pertaining to the astronomy of the spheres and to natural science, I do not consider that you should have any difficulty in grasping that those are matters necessary for the apprehension of the relationship of the world to God's governance, as this relation is in truth and not according to imaginings. So the Rambam just said a very important sentence here that needs to be unpacked for just a moment. What the Rambam is referring to is a study of the celestial spheres. Now, this is a concept we've made reference to this before in previous instruction. What he's basically telling us is that if you study Aristotelian science regarding the celestial spheres, this is truly obvious that you need a knowledge of this in order to be able to understand or have an entree to God. Now, what do we mean by the celestial spheres? There was a medieval concept. It's called the Ptolemaic, Ptolmaic model of concentric spheres, or the Ptolemaic model of the heavenly bodies. And basically, what it describes is the Earth in the center of concentric, transparent spheres that surround our planet, and these are transparent spheres that are embedded in these spheres are the stars and all of the other celestial bodies, including the moon, the sun, and the planets. And it is through the motion of these spheres that we see the motions of the stars and all of the other celestial bodies around us. Now, Aristotle came up with a further idea involved in the celestial spheres. These are not just inanimate objects, but rather these are spheres that possess intelligence or sentience and play a role in creating a conduit between the infinitude of God and the finite corporeal state that our world finds itself in. And this dates back to what we would call Neoplatonism. Islamic philosophy in the times of the Rambam is a hybridization of Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism. And that's why we find these kinds of discussions throughout the Rambam. He accepts the philosophy of his day as accepted scientific fact in the description of the way that the celestial bodies operate. And therefore the Rambam says it quite explicitly that these relationships between the celestial spheres and God are in truth and not according to our imaginings, meaning that he believes not only that are they true, but they've also been proven scientifically. And that's not something for us to go into now. I would draw your attention to an encyclopedia entry from the Jewish Virtual Library.org on the entry called Emanation. And this is in your handout, source number 2. Emanation is a theory describing the origin of the material universe from a transcendent first principle. According to this theory, the universe, which is multiple, is generated from the one, which is unitary, through the medium of a hierarchy of immaterial substances. This is really the primary dilemma that Neoplatonism seeks to resolve in the medieval Islamic milieu, is to try and explain how our world that we perceive as being filled with multiplicity and diversity and a lack of unity, how that emanates from the one unitary creator, because normally we imagine that anything that is created should resemble its creator. So why is it that if we believe that God is completely unitary and indivisible, does our world is comprised of things that are so antithetical to that idea of unitariness? Why is that? I mean, how can it be that we are a product of the unitary God and we are not unitary? That's essentially the question. And so the way that this is explained is that there are a multiple series of intermediary forces which God created between himself and our world, and through those immaterial substances, which we call the celestial spheres, God causes an emanation of himself to flow from the outermost sphere, and that outermost sphere takes that emanation of God, of the divinity, and filters it to the next sphere. But in the course of filtering it to the next sphere, it corrupts or degrades it slightly, that emanation that it received, so that the emanation that it passes on to the next sphere below it is somewhat of a degraded quality. And the next sphere does the same to the next sphere, and so on and so forth until it gets to our world. And that is how corporeality and materiality come to exist, because it is through a filtered process of emanations that over the course of a series of several emanations, iterations of emanation, there is a breakdown or some kind of, like, the game of telephone where the message is corrupted along the way. That's how our world, which is imperfect and flawed, can be a product of the perfect and unitary God. I continue in this encyclopedia entry. The ultimate source is undiminished, while the beings which are emanated are progressively less perfect as they are further removed from the first principle. In medieval Arabic and Jewish Neo-Aristotelianism, the Neoplatonic theory of emanation was applied to the Aristotelian Ptolemaic cosmology, which posited a series of 9 concentric spheres encompassing the earth, each endowed with an intelligence. Thus, Aristotle's active intellect, which is a more advanced topic, it's sort of like an intellect that is a part of this system, was identified either with Plotinus's universal intellect in the Neoplatonic hierarchy, or with the intelligence of the lowest sphere of the moon in the Aristotelian Ptolemaic cosmology. A lot of stuff that's we're not going to go into today because it's a little bit too advanced of a topic, but we'll get there eventually because the Rambam will make reference to the Seichel HaPoel, to the active intellect, which we'll get there later on. But in any event, this is what the Rambam means. He says it's quite self-evident that if you want to be able to understand God, you have to understand those intermediary immaterial forces that he created above us that allowed for that filtration system and that system of emanation to come to us. So you have to understand how these concentric spheres operate, this which is part of the natural science of our time. If you don't understand that, how can you possibly understand God? We continue. There are also many speculative subjects that, although no premises can be obtained from them for the use of this science, nevertheless train the mind and procure it the habitus of drawing inferences and knowledge of the truth in matters pertaining to its essence. What the Rambam is saying over here is that in addition to studying creation, there are many other subjects of knowledge that a person needs to study, not because they will directly help you understand God better, but rather they will reinforce your brain muscle to think correctly, to know how to study methodically. In other words, like, for example, people say that if you study Talmud, then it's very easy for you to go to law school and become a successful lawyer. Not because necessarily every page of the Talmud has applications to the practice of law, but rather more so because the Talmudic thinking and Talmudic reasoning helps train your mind to think in a way that a lawyer needs to think. Similarly, what the Rambam is saying is there are many areas of study, of knowledge, that may not directly lead you to an understanding of God, but they do actually help to attenuate and strengthen your mind so that you're able to study things better and think better in a way that will help you gain access to God. They also put an end to the confusion in most of the minds of those engaged in speculation, a confusion mistaking things that are accidental for those that are essential. And here he's using, again, Aristotelian terminology. There are basically 2 types of features or qualities that every object has. Every object has either essential qualities or accidental qualities or characteristics. Just by way of analogy, if I take some wool that I've just sheared off of a sheep, I have raw wool. So there are essential qualities to that wool. The essential qualities of that wool is that it's soft and that it may have like an off-white color, and it's got a fluffy type of feel to it. If I drop that wool into a vat of dye, let's say a vat of red dye, and I dye that wool red, so now it has a new characteristic of being red wool. But there are essential characteristics to that wool in that it is soft and fluffy, and it has accidental characteristics, or meaning not essential, non-intrinsic, in that it is now red. And there are many ways of breaking this up in even finer discussions of more esoteric ideas, that everything has either essential or intrinsic characteristics, or it has non-essential or accidental characteristics. And when you study more certain areas of knowledge, you're able to distinguish between that which is essential and that which is accidental. Hereby an end is also put to the perversion of opinions arising out of this confusion. So once you're able to distinguish between those 2 types of things, have a greater level of clarity. All this is achieved in addition to the representation of these subjects as they really are, even if they in no way belong to the divine science. There's a value in focusing the mind in general and learning these subjects because they'll help you gain clarity and give you mental acuity. These subjects are also not devoid of utility in other points, namely with respect to matters that lead up to that science. In other words, and also they will also help you eventually gain access to other subjects which will lead to divine science. Accordingly, it is certainly necessary for whoever wishes to achieve human perfection to train himself at first, and he lists 4 specific things, the last one being divine science. So what you should focus on is logic, then he says mathematical sciences, and then in the natural sciences. So bottom line is, logics, the study of the rules of logic, may not lead you directly towards understanding God, but they will certainly train your mind and lead you to a better knowledge of mathematics. And through a better knowledge of mathematics, you'll understand what God is not. And through a study of the natural sciences of the world around you, that will gain you a more direct knowledge of understanding God, or what he calls divine science. Let's continue. We find many people whose mind stops short at one of these sciences. And sometimes, even if their mind does not miss the mark, they are cut off by death while engaged in some preliminary study. And now the Rambam is getting into a related topic, which is that think about the immensity of this project. That, first of all, so many people are not able to follow through with all of these intellectual endeavors and all of these different disciplines of study. So many people fall short. And not only do so many people fall short, but so many people who really do persevere don't have time. They run out of time. They run out of a lifetime, because so many of these subjects can take years and years and even decades of one's life to study properly. I mean, think of people who have devoted their lives to science and philosophy, and really, by the time they leave the world, they feel that I still haven't gained sufficient knowledge in the particular discipline in which I have developed an expertise. And he says, so how do we expect any individual to gain access to divine science if so many of these subjects in and of themselves can take a lifetime of study? So he therefore presents us with an idea which I want to unpack for a moment. He says, accordingly, if we never in any way acquired an opinion through following traditional authority, and were not correctly conducted towards something by means of parables, but were obliged to achieve a perfect representation by means of essential definitions, and by pronouncing true only that which is meant to be pronounced true in virtue of a proof or demonstration, which would be impossible except after the above-mentioned lengthy preliminary studies, this state of affairs would lead to all people dying without having known whether there is a deity for the world or whether there is not, much less whether a proposition should be affirmed with regard to him or a defect denied. And he says, no one would ever be saved from this perdition except one of a city or 2 of a family. So basically what the Rambam is saying is as follows. He's explaining in this course of this very lengthy sentence why it is necessary for there to be a misorah, for there to be a tradition about God passed down to us from the prophets who had a prophetic experience and an understanding of Hashem. Why do we need to learn about God from Tanakh and from Torah Sheba'al Peh? The Rambam says it's very simple, because if you were to only be expected to learn about God through the progressive, very natural process of studying all the things that I've just mentioned, logic, mathematics, natural science, and only then study about God because you've discovered God naturally through this very organic, natural process, most people would not live out a normal lifespan of 70, 80 years to get to that point of divine science, to gain a knowledge of God. It is therefore necessary to sort of circumvent that entire process from a time when you were very young and to rely on a tradition of what and who God is based on what the prophets have told us, based upon what our ancestors have taught us about God. And this is a very important point which I feel we need to really hone in on very carefully. We're running out of time, but I'm going to leave with this topic for today. The Rambam feels that the most authentic and the most effective way for the human being to understand God is through an organic process of intellectual pursuit. And if you don't go through this methodical, very difficult and painstaking process, you will only get a second best, an inferior knowledge of Hashem, an inferior, or sort of a cheat sheet that gives you only the bottom line, but not a true, robust knowledge of God that is fitting to a human being who has worked hard to perfect his or her intellect. But with the acknowledgement that most people will not be able to go through this very difficult regimen, the Rambam says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in his infinite wisdom, gave us a Torah, gave us a tradition, gave us a Mesorah about himself via his prophets, and in so doing provided us a pathway to have some access to him even without going through this painstaking process. And that was necessary because otherwise most people would never understand or have any access to Hashem, because this process is only for the intellectual elite and is not accessible to most people alive, most human beings who don't have the discipline and the intellectual prowess or the opportunity to go through this very difficult and painstaking process. This is where we really need to stay focused, because this is a Maimonidean attitude which is shared by other great philosophers of his ilk, like the Ibn Ezra, and an entire school of medieval thinkers who are rationalists, who believe that the truest access to Hashem is through the intellect. I wish to contrast this approach with the approach of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who is also living shortly before the Rambam, in the Kuzari, who takes a diametrically opposite approach to the Rambam. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's attitude is that the intellect is the process and the tool that presents us with limitations in our accessibility to Hashem. If you're only going to try and understand God through an intellectual process, you will invariably fall short, because the human intellect, because of its finite limitations, can only access so much knowledge about the divine and the infinite. Our intellects are non-infinite. Our intellects are confined by their corporeal existence and their corporeal essence. So there's no way that the mind can ever really truly access a real understanding or knowledge of God in its truest form. The only way to really access God is through the prophetic experience. And the Nevukhim, the prophets, had a far better understanding of God than any human being, Jew or non-Jew, who tried to access a knowledge of the divine through their intellect alone. Nevuah, for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, is the key to knowing Hashem, and the intellect is the second best. For the Rambam, the intellect is the true way of knowing Hashem, and Nevuah is a secondary option for those who don't have time to utilize their intellect to gain entree to the Almighty. And this is a very important topic which we're going to touch upon over and over again in our discussion to understand this true dichotomy between the Rambam and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, because it also begins to provide us with a divide between the world of rationalism and the world of mysticism. And there's much more to unpack on this particular topic, but we're not going to be able to do that today. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says that you are best off relying on a Mesorah, relying on a tradition passed down to us by our Nevi'im, because you will get a better understanding of Hashem, and your intellect, not only is it limited in its capacity, but it also is liable to deceive you and to bring you down dangerous labyrinths of falsehood, such as we saw by Elisha ben Abuya. And we will get to that again when we continue this topic and continue the third cause that prevents the acquisition of esoteric knowledge. So, Emir Hashem, God willing, we will finish the third cause, hopefully next week in our discussion. And but I just wanted you to hold on to that idea for today. This divide in approach between the Rambam and Rebbe Yehuda Halevi. But remember this: the Rambam's whole foundational concept is you can only access God in the highest form, in the highest way, in the best way, if you utilize the intellect and you spend a lifetime focusing on honing your intellect, strengthening your intellect to gain access to Hashem. I hope you have a fantastic day, a fantastic week. Look forward to seeing you next week.